Good morning. So I'm going to talk about a project I've been developing over the past year called Datasette. But before I dive into Datasette and what it is and what you can do with it, I wanted to give you a bit of background about why I created this tool. So a few years ago, I was working in the field of data journalism for the Guardian newspaper in the UK. And data journalism, if you haven't heard of it, is a absolutely fascinating discipline. It's when you, as a software engineer, get to work with journalists to help build tools that let them unravel data and find the stories in the data that's out there in the world. And the reason I got into it at The Guardian is I joined the newspaper, started getting introduced to different people, and met this chap called Simon Rogers, who was a journalist in the newsroom who was responsible for collecting all of the information for the infographics that were published in the newspaper. You know, newspapers publish maps and charts and all sorts of things like that, and somebody has to go out there and get the data. So this chap was a journalist with a fantastic knack and a very detailed Rolodex for getting hold of data on anything you could imagine. He knew exactly who to call at government agencies or in business to get the data that was needed for the stories. And so I asked him, this is really cool, but where does this data go? And he said, oh, it's all in Excel spreadsheets on my desktop computer under my desk. And I had a look in his folder, and he had hundreds of absolute, like, solid diamond files full of facts about the world. So I hooked him up with the web team at The Guardian. We started thinking, OK, what is the easiest way that we can start publishing this data and making it valuable beyond just appearing as a chart in the newspaper? And so we ended up launching a thing called the Guardian Data Blog. And the idea with the data blog was you're collecting this data, you publish the story, what about publishing the data behind it? And in the end, we realized that by far the easiest way to get that data out there, this was back in 2009, 2010, was to use Google Spreadsheets. So we had a blog, and we'd collect data for the newspaper, and then we would publish it as a Google spreadsheet for anyone to dive in, export the data, and start doing interesting things with it. And it actually developed a really interesting community around it. We had a Flickr group, this is very 2009, 2010 era, for the Guardian data store, with all of these people who were pulling that data, making their own visualizations, sharing them with each other. It was a really exciting thing. But I was kind of frustrated that Google Sheets ended up being the state of the art for sharing data online. And I've been frustrated ever since. And then last year, I realized that the world had evolved to a state where it was possible to build much better tools for doing this kind of data set sharing. And so that was the inspiration for this project that I've called Datasette. It's a tool for exploring and publishing data. And what I'll do is I'll jump straight into an example to show you what this tool looks like and what it can do. I'll start with 538. 538, the blog that was originally a baseball blog and then became politics and all sorts of things, they do an amazing job of publishing the data behind their stories. This is a classic 538 story, and you'll notice that there's a little link there that says Get the Data on GitHub. If you click on that link, you'll find that they have a GitHub repository with literally hundreds of CSV files in it. And every time they publish a new story with data, they try and put that data on GitHub as a CSV file. GitHub actually does this nice little trick where if something is CSV, it renders it as a table. And so I set up a Travis CI job that pulls this repository once a day, checks to see if there's anything new in it, and if it does, it automatically publishes it using my Datasette tool. So let's dump out of the slides and jump straight into a demo. So this is a very classic Datasette instance. Datasette is a web application which, given one or more databases, gives you a UI for browsing and viewing and exploring that data. This is 538 have 403 CSV files that they've published. I've converted every single one of those CSV files into a database table. And if I dive in, this is actually a story they published just last week about the candidates that the Democrats are putting up in primaries around the country. And the actual Datasette interface is basically, it's this bit here. So it's a table, which is unsurprising considering it's tabular data. You can do things like order by column. Let's order by partisan lean. I can't remember quite how they calculate, but I think they've got this covered in their documentation. But Datasette also looks at that table and tries to see if it can identify opportunities for faceting that data. In this case, it thinks that we can facet on office type, and there we go. So there are 687 candidates who are up for representative, 100 for governor, 24 for senator. I think if I do if I do one primary, I can see just the candidates who have won the primary. So there are 239 candidates who've won their primary. Of those, there are 21 who are running for governor. I can click through this and start seeing just those just the candidates who are running for governor who've passed their primary. But what's fun about this is I put almost zero effort into this thing. I got the CSV file, converted it into this database, and then all of the other stuff, the faceting and the browse and the filter, you essentially get for free. And it's not just HTML. If you click the JSON link, you get that same data back as JSON. This is served using cross-origin headers. So if you want to start building a little JavaScript app right now that interacts with this set of data, there's nothing to stop you. The data's online. It's ready for you to start interacting with. The same thing for pulling that data into Jupyter Notebooks or however it is you like to modify data. And I've also got CSV export. So if I click CSV, I can get a CSV file, in this case, just of those candidates who are running for governor who've passed their primary. And going one step further than that, I mentioned that this is all a database under the hood. Because it's read-only, there's no reason for me not to allow you to run your own SQL queries against that data. Normally, when you're building web applications, this is the worst thing you can possibly do. This is a SQL injection attack, which is liable to have people destroy everything that you've built. But if you're using a read-only database, there's actually no harm that I can cause from this prompt. You know, I can run different select queries, but I can't cause any real damage. Datasette has a couple of measures it takes to try and stop harmful SQL. It gives SQL queries up to a second to execute, and if they take longer than that, it returns an error to try and stop people from running denial of service queries. But generally, this, and the other really interesting thing about this, if you're, say, a JavaScript developer, is because you've got full SQL here that you can stick in the URL at the top there and use to get back data, you can essentially have SQL in your JavaScript that gets back just the subset of fields that you want and returns them to you. It's kind of like everyone's excited about GraphQL these days. Well, SQL's done the same thing since the 1970s, so it's kind of an exciting capability to have as a developer who just wants to put things together really quickly. So that's the sort of fundamental, ooh, what just happened there? That was interesting, okay. So that's the fundamental Datasette interface. That's what some of the things it lets you do. I mentioned it has this ability to filter and facet. There's JSON APIs for everything, and you get the ability to export things back out as CSV if you want to pull them into Excel. But the secret source of all of this is the SQLite database that it's running on top of. And SQLite is the world's most widely used database, possibly one of the world's most widely used pieces of software in general. It runs in literally everything. There is a SQLite database on my watch right now, counting my steps. My phone is completely full of them. My computer has huge numbers of them. Because it's open source. It's actually a public domain license. It's crazy fast. And one of the nicest characteristics of it is that a SQLite database is just a single file on disk. It's a star.db or star.sqlite file, which means they're really easy to back up and to copy around. And you can upload them and email them around. And you don't have to worry about sort of obscure areas of your disk that are off limits because MySQL or Postgres are managing complex sets of data there. SQLite notoriously does not scale very well for writing. I mean, it's fine on a single core, but if you're building a web application with writes coming in from everywhere, you tend to use MySQL or Postgres. But for the use case I care about, writes don't matter at all. I'm only dealing with read-only data. I want to create a database, publish it once as a sort of snapshot in time, and then leave it there. So actually, SQLite's biggest disadvantage turns out not to affect my use case for it at all. And in fact, what it lets you do is it lets you ship both the database and the code that executes the database and the code that shows you the interface as part of the same container if you're using Docker containers. So actually, all of the things that I've built on top of this are shipped as a single Docker container, which might be a little bit of Python code for the application itself, and then a few megabytes or up to a couple of gigabytes of SQLite database file. Once you've got that as a container, you can host it anywhere that knows how to run containers, which is an increasing number of hosting providers today. So to emphasize this point about SQLite, I'm going to do a quick search of my computer. I'm going to say find in my library folder any file where the name contains star.sqlite. And that's an enormous quantity of things. It turns out 1Password's using SQLite. Apple Game Center uses it. Firefox, Chrome, and Safari all use SQLite for bookmarks and for browser histories and so forth. There's Evernote has all of my data in SQLite. There's all of this different stuff. So To be a bit more interesting, I'm going to run this command here, which looks for SQLite files and then orders them by the largest ones first. So let's try and see what the biggest SQLite database some random application has created is. And if I run that, there's a 49 megabyte SQLite database called CLS Business Category Cache.SQLite, which is part of com.apple.photoanalysisd. I cannot figure out exactly what this is for. I've been Googling around and nobody seems to have deciphered it. But that's OK, because we can take a look and see what's in there. So you install Datasette through pip install Datasette. It's Python 3 only. And once you've got it, you run it as a command line tool. So I'm going to say Datasette on users, Simon, containers, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah. Starts up a little local web server. And if I double click on this, here is Datasette running against just this one weird and mysterious SQLite file that I found on disk. This thing has 397,000 rows in one of its tables. It's called Z business item. They're almost incomprehensible, but there are two fields. There's a Z latitude field and a Z longitude field, which looks suspiciously like it's a geographic coordinate. So I'm going to jump ahead a tiny little bit and show you one of the plugins that I've been building for Datasette. Datasette has a plugin mechanism which is designed to allow people to add additional features on top. So I'm running a plugin which looks for latitude and longitude columns, and if it finds them, it renders them on a map. Problem is, this isn't a latitude and longitude, it's a Z latitude and a Z longitude, so I need to write a query where I say select Z latitude as latitude, comma, Z longitude as longitude from that, and I'll get rid of that limit clause as well. So now that I've run this query, the results came back as latitude and longitude columns. This plugin spotted that and kicked in. And this is a very interesting mystery because this is a map of all of the places I've been in the last few years. I spent some time in Europe. I spent a little bit of time in South America, a bunch of time in California. And if I keep on zooming in, this is whatever this database table is, somehow my laptop has been keeping track of over, how many places was it? This is like thousands of places that I've been in the last few years. I'm assuming because it's in a photo analysis D thing, this is something to do with Apple Photos trying to magically figure out where each photograph was taken and assign it some kind of label. But again, the internet doesn't know anything about this. If you search for CLS Business Category Cache, there's a few posts on digital forensics forums, but nobody's quite nailed what this thing is doing. But it's kind of fun that you can run a couple of commands on your computer, find large SQLite databases and start diving in and seeing what they are and trying to figure out what they're being used for. So that's the most basic way that you can use Datasette is you can run it locally on your machine and you can play with SQLite databases that other people have created. Where it gets more fun is when you start creating your own SQLite databases. One of the reasons I feel like Datasette is as a product, it's a really great time for me to be working on this, is that for the past 10 years or so, there's been a movement towards open data and transparency all around the world. People saying, hey, governments, you've got all of this data. We, the people, demand that you release your data to us. And it turns out it worked. This is a map of 2,600 open data portals around the world. You can zoom in on this and find there are tiny little towns in Spain that have a portal where they publish all of this data that they've collected about their community. As an example, I won't explore this much now, but the city of San Francisco has a really, really good open data portal called Datasette, and it's got 469 datasets published on it, almost all of which are CSV files. So I was poking around this recently, and I found a freshly updated dataset. This is updated on May the 23rd, of city facilities. So this is buildings that are owned by the state of San Francisco. And you can hit export and CSV and grab that CSV file. I downloaded that earlier. Hold on a sec, sorry about this. Where's numbers? And here's what their CSV file looks like. So this is classic CSV. It's got addresses, the city, the zip code, which department owns the building, and that lovely latitude and longitude column so that we can start plotting these on a map. So I've downloaded that file. Here it is. It's called cityfacilities.csv. It's 330 kilobytes. And I'm going to use another tool that I built to convert this into a SQLite database. This is called CSVs to SQLite. It's open source. It's available on GitHub and PyBay. And I can feed it the name of a what was that thing called? City facilities. And I can say turn that into a database called facilities.db. You can feed this as many different CSV files as you like, and it'll combine them to a single database. So I'm going to run that. It'll churn away for a few seconds, and it's now created facilities.db, which is a SQLite file, 304 kilobytes. So let's open that up in Datasette. I've already got Datasette running on a different port. I'll put this on port 8002. So I'll open this up, and here we go. Now, again, it's got latitude and longitude columns, so my plugin kicks in and starts plotting these things on a map. It's actually 1,700 rows, but if you click the Load All button, it'll stick every single facility owned by the city of San Francisco on the map for me. There's a whole bunch over here. This is because of the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, I think, is why you've got stuff over there. But it's also got the faceting, so although the faceting doesn't seem to have worked, I'm going to have to hack a URL here. If I stick !_facet equals, and then the name of one of these columns, that will do me a faceting by department name. So you can see that the Recreation and Parks Department owns the most facilities. They've got 593. The airport has 115. If I click on that, I'm now just seeing the facilities around that airport. But again, I've done almost nothing to get this working. I downloaded a single CSV file, I ran a command, and now I've got this new interface for exploring and understanding that data. And again, I can get this stuff back out as CSV or as JSON and all of those kinds of things. Let's take this a step further and actually put this thing on the internet. So Datasette has a subcommand called publish. I can say Datasette Publish. I then tell it which provider I want to use. It supports at the moment Heroku and Zite now, and I'm hoping to people will add further providers through plugins in the future. So I'm going to say Datasette Publish now, facilities. I'm going to say name equals SF facilities. So I do that. It's deploying my database to the internet. It's synced the files. It's now going to give me a URL. I can go straight to that URL, and it'll, while it's building and deploying the application, it'll show me a bunch of like progress reports. So you can see right there, it's running. It's building a Docker container. It's pip installing Datasette. It's installing all the dependencies, and hopefully, in a few seconds, successfully tagged. This will turn into an actual live application that's running on the internet. There we go. So I navigate back to that URL again. The first time you hit a page, it takes a few seconds because it's launching a Docker image and so forth. But within a few seconds' time, this should turn into a fully hosted version of what I just showed you on my computer. And thanks to the JSON API, this now means that anyone who wants to start building their own applications on top of this data can just start doing it. So here we go. I'm not seeing the map because I didn't install the map plugin. You can actually run Datasette Publish now -- install equals Datasette cluster map, which is the name of the plugin. It'll do that. But yeah, that's so this lets you turn around, take a CSV file, turn it into a database, and then stick it on the internet in just a couple of minutes. I'm something of a side project addict. I'm very easily distracted by potential side projects. So this is sort of a disaster, because I'm launching 5 or 6 new databases a week of all sorts of things that I just came across. The facilities data here, I literally found out this existed yesterday, and now I'm obsessed with figuring out why they've got so much stuff around Hetchy and all of those different kinds of things. So this is all fine if you're a software engineer who knows how to set up Python virtual environments and make sure you've got Python 3 and pip install things and all of that kind of junk. But I mentioned earlier, I care about journalists. I want journalists to be able to use these tools. So I built another tool on top of this called Datasette Publish. And this is a web application that can deploy Datasette instances from CSV files without you having to install anything at all. The reason I could build this is that Zite, the hosting provider I'm using, Zite now, have an OAuth-enabled API for managing people's accounts and deploying applications to them. So if I click Get Started here, I'm now in an OAuth bounce. It's like, OK, do you want to grant Datasette Publish access to your Zite account? I'll say yes. And now I've got an interface where I can start uploading files. So I'm going to upload that cityfacilities.csv file. I can actually go a step further. This is exposing some of the other features of the CSVs to SQLite tool. I can do things like extract the department into a separate column. I can make it searchable by the common name to enable a search field. I'm going to extract the city as well. I'll stick SF facilities in there. Never mind. I'll do that. I encourage people to put in a source and a license on top of this data so that people understand what their rights are. And this time, I'm going to install a couple of plugins. I'm going to install that cluster map. So I click Publish, and it's now deploying to the account that is owned by the user who is logged into this tool. So here's that URL again. If I go here, it's doing that same thing that we saw earlier. Now, the crucial thing here is that this is being deployed not to anything that I, as the creator of Datasette, own or manage. It's being deployed to a hosting account owned by that user. And this, if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't have built this tool, because the last thing I want is to build a little side project which is suddenly responsible for gigabytes of data that people care about who they're uploading into my service. The way this works, if Datasette Publish drops off the face of the earth, everything that's been shipped through it will continue to work, and anyone who's used that tool will still have full control and access over the thing that they deployed. So you can see what the tool's actually doing here is it's running that CSVs to SQLite command against the, ooh, that's interesting. NumPy.dtype size change may indicate binary incompatibility. I'll have to look at that later. I don't think it's going to block it from running, though. So given a few more seconds, hopefully this will deploy a Datasette instance with the plugins that I requested as well. There we go. So while that's going on, I'll switch. So this is a couple of options you've got for creating databases. The first is you can just find them on your computer and publish your browser history to anyone who wants to have a look. The second one is you can use CSVs to SQLite to grab data that's already been published and convert it into your own database. If you don't want to install anything, you can use the Datasette Publish web tool to publish data, hopefully without too much fuss at all. And then the last thing that I wanted to show you, and I'll just see if that deploy is finished. Where's it gone? OK, yep, that deploy is finished. So here is that Datasette instance of facilities in San Francisco with the plugin, so you can browse that interactive map and see what's going on here. And you'll notice that this actually created more than one database table. This created city facilities from the CSV file. And then because I said I wanted to extract the cities and department names, it actually pulled those out into separate columns and set up foreign key relationships. So when I'm looking at this here, city says San Francisco. San Francisco is now a hyperlink through to that foreign key relationship. And if I, you know what, let's do recreation and parks. So then I can click from here back to a filtered view that shows me just the city facilities managed by the recreation and parks department. And those foreign key relationships are exposed through the CSV exports and the JSON and so forth as well. So that's those are tools if you've got CSV files. It turns out not all data is exposed as CSVs. And so a package I've been working on recently is a set of utility functions for making it as convenient as possible to turn non-CSV data into a SQLite database. And as an example, I'm going to use this. I'm going to take a look at data from the Python packaging index. This is a website which once a week runs a Google BigQuery table to figure out which are the most downloaded packages from PyPy, and it exposes them as an interface that you can browse here. But it also, it turns out, exposes them as JSON. So if I go to this URL, I get back a JSON list of the top 5,000 packages on PyPy just by their download count. Is that going to work? So pip has been downloaded, wow, 243 million times? It looks like in the past year, which is quite good going. But when I'm doing this kind of analysis, I like to spend as much of my time as possible in Jupyter notebooks. So this is a Jupyter notebook which can fetch that data and then start expanding it and turning it into a database. So I'm going to start by importing the requests library and fetching that 365, those top 365 records. I'm not going to do all 5,000 because we haven't got time to crawl everything here. But I've grabbed the top 100, and you can see there's pip, 6, Boto, core, Python, date, util, and so forth. And now what I need to do is, this isn't quite enough data to make an interesting database because I've just got the name and the count. If you go to pypy.org/pypy/the name of package/JSON, you actually get back a whole bunch of JSON data about that underlying package. And so what I can do now is I can loop through, I'm just going to do the top 20. I'll loop through the top 20, and for each one, I'm going to fetch that JSON data. I'm going to add that download count that I already have, and I'm going to stick that in a list of objects. So there we go. It's churning away. That's the top 20. And each of those records now looks like this. This is a JSON object. It's got an author, a list of classifiers, a description, the download count, which I added in from my other set of data, and it's sat there in a list. This is where SQLite utils comes in. One of the things you can do with SQLite utils is you can instantiate a new database by passing a path to a file. I said /temp/pypi.db. And then if you've got a list of JSON records, you can call insert_all and pass in that list. And the library will then look at that JSON, figure out what the columns should be on the database that will represent it, create a table with those columns, insert all of the data as efficiently as possible, and set it up as a newly created database table on disk. There are a few extra options. I can tell it what I want the primary key to be. Here I want the primary key to be the name of the package. And I can also tell it what order I want those columns to appear in when they're presented on screen. So I'm going to run this, and ooh, I think that constraint failed because I was running against a database I'd already created. Let's try this. There we go. So ran those two commands. I now have a file called pypi.db. If I run this against pypi2.db on port, I run out of ports a lot, 8003. Here is a database of a newly created database, which I can already start faceting against. See, Amazon Web Services have 3 of the packages in the top 20, which is surprising. But I can already start interacting with that data. You'll notice that the object that I passed in wasn't a straight up set of key value pairs. It also had some nested objects. And what this tool will do is it'll take those nested objects and it'll encode them as JSON in a column. Because it turns out the SQLite database actually has really robust JSON handling built in. So what port are we on? We're on port 8003. Oops. It's PyBay2, isn't it? So here's a SQL query that I can run where I'm asking SQLite to extract that classifiers column, treat it as JSON, break those lists up into individual values, and then run an aggregate count against them. And I can see that in those top 20 packages, every single one of them is intended audience developers. 5 of them are licensed under a BSD license. 3 of them are environment console. And you can go further with this stuff. And it was PyBay2, wasn't it? Port 8003. So I can then write a SQL command where I can paste in a classifier and see just the rows that were where the classifier column contains at least one instance of environment : console. This illustrates another fun feature of Datasette, which is that when you're writing SQL statements, you can include these named parameters. This is a SQLite standard. So if I say :classifier, it means this is a value that will be input from elsewhere. Datasette notices that, and it builds you a little HTML form. So on the basis of that one SQL query, it knows that there should be a form field called classifier, which the user should be able to enter data into. What's interesting about this is it means that you can build entire applications as straight-up bookmarkable URLs. Once you've got the data in, you can construct SQL queries that do something interesting, and then literally copy and paste the URL out of that URL bar, stick it in a blog entry or a tweet or email it to somebody, and they will then be able to interact with the application that you've built. Which I think is really fun. You know, it's kind of nice being able to package quite a complex set of functionality up into a URL that you can copy and paste and share around. And it means that you can iterate very quickly on this data and start figuring out, okay, what are the different capabilities that make sense and the queries that people might want to run. Oh, one last feature. SQLite has quite substantial built-in full-text search capabilities. So I've got a utility helper where I can say, enable full-text search against the name, summary, and keywords fields. And I'll run that. I'll restart Datasette. And so now that I've done that, Datasette notices that that full-text search has been configured against this table, and it adds a search box at the top. So now if I search for, say, YAML, it'll show me just the records that, that match that query for YAML. If you click View and Edit SQL, you can see how the underlying SQL query works. But I'm really quite amazed at how robust the search feature built into SQLite is. You can actually build some really nice search interfaces on top of this. And it turns out a lot of applications use exactly that. There were all kinds of, especially on Mac OS X, there are lots of applications that tie into the SQLite full text search to provide search within their help files or whatever it is that they want to expose. So, I mentioned plugins briefly. Datasette Cluster Map you've already seen. It visualizes anything with a latitude and longitude column. There's another plugin I've built called Datasette Vega, which attempts to which gives you tools to build graphs on top of the data that you're expressing. And my goal is to build an entire plugin ecosystem around this. So as people come up with more and more esoteric things they need to be able to do, I don't have to ship them as part of Datasette Core, but I can encourage people to build them out as plugins instead. I've got a whole bunch of plans for pushing this stuff forward. In the short term, I want to have much better support for many-to-many relationships, because that's a thing that shows up a great deal in the real world, and it would be nice to let people facet and filter by those in addition to the tools that I have at the moment. SQLite has a GIS extension called SQLite, which is phenomenally powerful. It lets you load in complex geometries, the shapes of cities, towns, states, measure areas and distances and so on. And I've had quite a bit of success playing around with that with Datasette already, but I want to double down and get a really nice suite of GIS tools built on top of this as well. And next month, SQLite 3.25 is shipping with support for window functions, which, if you've used them in Postgres or SQL Server, you'll know are an incredibly powerful way of doing complex analytics queries against time series. And Datasette will essentially get that stuff for free once it's shipped as part of SQLite, which I'm really excited about. And on top of all of this, I'm working towards a 1.0 release where 1.0, because I have a plugin mechanism, 1.0 is the point at which your plugins aren't going to break when I ship new features. So there's a whole bunch of work I need to do to make sure that the plugin hooks make sense, are well documented, and that they serve the kind of needs that people have for them. So the world is full of interesting data, it turns out, and it's being published in this incredible array of open data portals at an astonishing rate. Let's publish it. Let's collect it together and try and publish it in the most useful way possible. If you're interested, all of the stuff is online. I will be posting the slides and more detailed notes on Twitter and on my blog this afternoon. And hopefully, I've got a little bit of time for questions. So thank you very much.
So we can take questions.
So one thing that just jumped out at me was kudos to thinking about the sustainability of the projects you're delivering to other people. Even if you go away, your project doesn't go away. But from the sustainability perspective, is this a side project? Is this a business? Is this something that you're...
It's very deliberately a side project because I've done startups with business in the past, and I kind of feel like open source, for the things I want to achieve with this, having this as a completely open source owned by the community thing is much better for its longevity than patching it up as a commercial entity. So yeah, it's very much a side project. I'm very deliberate. I've done a lot of side projects in the past, which is why I have a aversion to anything where I'm responsible for other people's data and information. So yeah, I want to keep this completely open and in the spirit of helping people solve their own problems and making sure that it has long-term sustainability as a project.
Amazing.
Hi, thanks so much for this. This is a really fascinating presentation. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about kind of the newsroom use case and how you envision journalists using this. Is this something that you think...
I can show you an example.
Yeah. Thank you.
So the Baltimore Sun, it's a young project. I've heard tale of various news organizations that are using it internally, which thrills me, but it's not something I can demonstrate. The best public deployment I've seen so far has been the Baltimore Sun, who gathered information on the salary records of every person employed by the state of Maryland, and publish. This is actually a Datasette instance with a custom template and theming over the top. And based on their feedback, I got to expand the theming support and so on. But this is straight up Datasette. This is, they actually released all of the source code for the bits that they did as well. And this is an example of exactly the kind of project I want to see people building. You know, it's a way of taking quite a complex set of data and exposing it and making it public in a way that is hopefully as easy as possible for members of the public to understand.
More questions?
So how big of a data set do you think this can scale to?
So how big of a data set can this scale to? The theoretical maximum for SQLite is 144 terabytes. And I've not managed to get together a 144 terabyte database, but a lot of the databases I've been playing with are in the multi-gigabyte range, and it's just flawless. Because if you think about SQLite, it's designed to run on basically everything, right? It's amazingly good at making the most of the resources that you throw at it, which means it scales down to like a step counter on my watch, but it also scales up to anything that'll fit on disk. It's a classic relational database. It's got support for indexes and full text search indexes, and there's R trees and all sorts of things. So no, the theoretical maximum is almost unlimited to my surprise. The bigger problem I'm having is finding hosting where I can stick a gigabyte of SQLite. So Heroku and Lite now, I absolutely love them, but both of them I think have a 100 to 500 megabyte limit on the files that you can upload to them. So I'm trying to figure out a nice sort of platform or some kind of serverless functions service environment that lets me stick these 10 gigabytes databases in it.
Thank you. This is amazing. I know it's focused on static data, but what happens if you serve, or can you serve a SQLite database that is being written to by another process?
At the moment, you cannot serve a SQLite database that's being written to. I am considering. I'm thinking about trying to get that to work, but a lot of the assumptions on this have been baked into the idea that you're opening it in an immutable mode, so you can do that. So theoretically, it could be done, but it would be quite a lot of work to get it there. What I'm doing instead is I have all sorts of things that get republished on a daily basis, and you could bump that up to hourly or every 10 minutes if you really wanted to. Well, so when I'm using Lite now, they actually let you deploy, every instance that you deploy to them stays there forever with this weird random URL, and then you point an alias at it. So 538.datasets.com is the latest alias, and I've probably got about 100 versions of this database running on different instances, but it's only the most recent one that gets pointed to by the URL.
If take the example of the Baltimore one, do you have any recommendations for publishers of data? You've made it so easy to be able to bring CSV and other formats in, but for publishers, should they think about, is there anything they can do to make it easier to get their data into Datasette, like providing a SQLite database directly to begin with?
So that's actually a feature of Datasette is that the SQLite database is available to download at the bottom of the page. So you can always get it back out again. But yeah, I think SQLite is a really interesting format for data publication in general. I'm hoping I can start promoting that as an option for people. The Library of Congress now lists SQLite as one of a very small number of recommended formats for long-term archiving of data, because it's crazy fast, it's a single file, it's extremely stable. You can open a SQLite database that was created like 7 years ago and it'll still work fine today. So yeah, I think it's a much more functional way of sharing data that doesn't fit into that classic grid. The moment you've got like foreign key relationships and stuff, I honestly don't know of anything better for sharing more complex data shapes.
Can you speak as to, this is a bit of a hard problem, but the ethics of kind of putting data out there. So that example you just gave in terms of salaries, a little dangerous. There's not necessarily an analysis to go with it. There might be many reasons why someone would earn a high salary.
Yes.
I happened to look at this a while ago when it was published. I think it was something about like royalties on a patent or something like that, which is a reason why someone would make a large salary, and we wouldn't want people to be harassed as a result of having their salary up. So what do you think about that?
So those ethics, I think, are crucially important, but that's in the journalism field. Journalists, the journalists at the Baltimore Sun, I know have been doing this for a very long time, and I'm certain that they have had extensive conversations about how that kind of thing should work. My sort of contribution to the ethics on this stuff is that I've got the source and licensing stuff is baked into how Datasette works. So you can publish data without a source and a license, but I very much encourage people to always cite where the data came from. I mean, beyond that, it's certainly something that people do need to think about. And I've taken a sort of neutral stance on it, other than encouraging citation and making sure that people are being ethical, at least in terms of that. But yeah, it's something that people definitely need to consider when they're. And actually, I do have a story from my time at The Guardian about this. When I was working at The Guardian newspaper, we actually, this was 2009, it was very early WikiLeaks things started coming in. And WikiLeaks got hold of the membership list of the British National Party, which is basically the sort of like hard right-wing fascist party in British politics. And they had a list of 15,000 names and addresses and postcodes. Now, we were not going to publish the names and addresses of people on this list. That would be grotesquely unethical. So what we did instead is we resolved their postcodes down to parliamentary constituencies, which are quite large areas, and generated a heat map showing which areas of the country had the most members, most people who were listed in that, which is totally impossible to derive that back to personally identifiable information. But it gave us a really interesting visualization of where the hotspots for that list were around the country.
Any more questions? Awesome. Okay. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
That was a great discussion.